welcome to our Wisdom Whispers this month with Erika Nabuurs um, in beautiful British Columbia with a beautiful blue sky behind her. Today we're gonna dive deeper to level up. Erika is a medicine woman, a keynote speaker, TEDx speaker, mother, coach, and much more. Erika, I'll hand over to you, and you can tell us a little bit more about what you do.
Plethora of therapeutic modalities, but I'm a trained naturopathic doctor. I no longer carry a license. I choose to walk my own road, and I focus primarily on trauma resolution. But within trauma resolution, I work with the resolving of chronic disease as well, because the physical chronic disease is always intertangled with and generally an expression of underlying emotional, psychological traumas and spiritual and or electromagnetic disharmonies or imbalances. So I enjoy addressing what I consider the entire spectrum of the organism, and I dance with each level of the being at various times throughout the therapeutic journey. But I also endeavor to address all levels simultaneously as well, because for me, every level is just a different language of the body, and the aspects of the being are just expressing themselves in different ways, with using different languages, but trying to demonstrate that they need help, they need resolution. So whether it's a liver disease, or whether it's anger expression, which is hosted in the liver, or whether it's a solar plexus issue on an electromagnetic level, it's all really the same thing, just the body trying to get the attention, or the being trying to get the attention through different mediums. So I've spent a lot of time learning the languages on the different levels through medical training, and then through, or first through neuropsych degree in undergrad. So I have the psychology and the emotional component from that paradigm, and then the physiology from the naturopathic medical training. And then beyond the medical training, I was invited into the Sisiwas Medicine Circle of the Pacific Northwest. So it's the traditional traveling medicine people of these lands, and I've gained a lot of incredible experience and medicine, fundamentally incredible medicine, from connecting with the lands and the spirits and the people and the ways and the practices of this land. So all of it informs in the therapeutic approach that I dance with my patients. And so I do one-on-one therapy work, but then I also expand into doing group work. And one of the most exciting group projects that I do is the Dive Deep to Level Up with the dolphins. So it's a sing and swim with the dolphins currently in Hawaii, but I'm looking at other areas. We have a lot of dolphins around here as well. I just haven't connected yet with a dolphin pod here. I have connected with a pod in Hawaii, so I work with them, but endeavoring to connect with a pod here and also in the Bahamas. So yeah, really exciting, and I'll get into some of that as we go through the presentation today. And I feel that we'll do it somewhat informally. I'll go through most of the content, and then we can open it up to questions and interaction. So welcome to Dive Deep to Level Up, where we're integrating the fractured pieces of the inner child to resolve trauma and restore magic, joy, and play. Before we get into, well, I'll give you, I guess, a quick breakdown of what we're going to be talking about today. So we'll be looking at the subtleties of trauma-driven triggers. We'll be looking at the influences of long-standing unresolved trauma on daily choices and behaviors, and the ability of unresolved trauma to create reoccurring patterns throughout life, causing scenarios with increasing loudness or increasing intensity, which results in what I describe as compounded trauma. and also looking at the ability of unresolved trauma to interfere with our personal growth and our professional development. I'll also touch on the value and the process of integrating the inner child into the current conscious experience in order to eliminate those trauma-driven triggers and restore our ability to celebrate life and to experience life from the current moment. And finally, I'll outline the capacity of wild dolphins to help us anchor and apply our restoration of magic and play in an epic real life experience. And so before I get into some of that content, I just want to outline two main concepts in quantum physics. One specifically, which offers an explanation and a validation for the basis of the work that I do. So the first one is entanglement. I'm sure looking at the crowd, you guys are familiar with entanglement, but basically it's two particles that were once physically close together, considered a pair, and they're now spread apart across vast distance of space and arguably time. So, but these two particles remain connected, and when one particle moves in a particular direction, instantly the other particle moves in the exact and opposite direction. So this reality has been shown at the subatomic level, but it's also been shown at the level of larger particles like diamonds, for example. So it's a really exciting reality. And then in addition to the entanglement concept, we have what's called delayed choice entanglement swapping. So delayed choice entanglement swapping demonstrates that information between entangled particles can actually travel backward in time, which allows past events to be changed by current or present actions. So just to reiterate, this concept is confirming and has been reliably duplicated in the physics realm to demonstrate that past events can be changed by present or current actions. And so this is really the basis or an explanation of how the work that I do with integrating the inner child is actually influencing current realities for people. So it's really exciting. And so as I move through the presentation, just remember that this concept validates the basis of the therapeutic approach that I'm talking about. And I'm going to to explain delayed choice entanglement swapping, essentially you have two pairs of two particles. So one pair of two particles is moving in exact and opposite direction in the UK, for example, and another pair of particles is moving in exact and opposite direction in Germany. And then we take one of each of those one particle from each pair, and we separate it and send them to Canada. So those two are moving in their own direction. And then if a scientist, or if we'll talk about scientists first. If a scientist chooses to entangle these particles, then based on the concept of entanglement, those particles will instantly start moving in exact and opposite direction, which instantly influences their counter pair particle in the UK and in Germany, which instantly then creates a correlation in the movement between the particle in the UK and the particle in Germany, which were previously unrelated. Now they're correlated. And what they've found is that correlation now exists actually in retrospect and in retroactivity and in proactivity. So this movement is now how or this correlation is how these particles now are and were and will be all simultaneously. It's not that it just started in this moment, but it existed. It's now the new reality of these particles. And this demonstrates that the change of these particles, or it changes the reality of their spin, which demonstrates the fact that the actions that we take in our present moment are influencing and changing events in our past. So when we take healing down out of the realm of chemistry and pharmaceuticals and bring it down into a more fundamental level of physics, we discover really exciting potential resolutions for long-standing chronic diseases that often people find reoccurring and recreating themselves over time. So I'm going to move into talking a little bit about trauma-driven triggers. And fundamentally, a trigger is like a vortex, which sucks us back into a past event and causes us to relive our trauma all over again. And some people describe, how do I want to, in my experience, trauma originates out of a source moment or a trauma imprint moment. And some people consider that moment to be in childhood, in this lifetime. Some people consider that moment to be in a past lifetime. And some people consider that moment to be somewhere through the generational lineage. So to me, these are all just different, again, just different languages. And we can talk about the origin trauma happening in this lifetime or in a past lifetime or in throughout the generational line. And or we can talk about all three at the same time, or we can choose the language that the individual is most comfortable with. But fundamentally, there was an origin or a source moment when an event happened wherein the body mounted a stress response because of fear, generally because of fear. And the stress response then prevented the individual from living through that experience to the depth that it needed and wanted to. So it wasn't able to experience the emotional depth of the event, and it wasn't able to share verbally, vocally. It wasn't able to speak the things it wanted to say in the midst of that event. It wasn't able to take the actions that it needed or wanted to take in the midst of that event. And so the event itself ends up being suppressed in the body tissue, in the psyche, and in the electromagnetic field of the being. So it creates this imprint, which then moving forward in life, the being perpetually tries to resolve. And what I've seen in my work is that the resolution attempt occurs via reoccurring pattern. So the individual, the subconscious tries to recreate a scenario where they recreate similar or maybe different details, maybe a different location, maybe different people involved, but the underlying theme of this scenario is the same, and there's a common thread throughout each attempt. And as they recreate a scenario, they're giving themselves the opportunity to fully experience this event, to embrace all of the emotionality that comes with this event, and to let themselves feel it in a parasympathetic state. So nervous system, we have two branches, well, many branches, and I'll get into that in a moment. But I'm focused specifically on the autonomic nervous system, which branches into parasympathetic dominance and sympathetic dominance. And so the being wants to experience this event while existing in a parasympathetic dominant state. And yet, as they move through the experience, there comes a moment, because they don't necessarily have all the tools that they need to retain or or activate the parasympathetic nervous system, there comes a moment where they mount a fear response, and they then shift into sympathetic dominant nervous system reactivity. So, and that's the moment when all of the aspects of that event then again get suppressed into the soma, into the psyche, and into the electromagnetic field, and it becomes a new trauma. So the trauma then gets compounded, and in the next attempt, maybe days later, maybe weeks later, maybe months later, it could be years later, when they attempt to recreate a new scenario, it becomes a scenario with louder intensity. So, and I put it in quotations, I call it degrees of loudness. So instead of listening to our whispers, we need to create screams in order to get our own attention and to finally address some of our fundamental or underlying issues. And if we neglect to truly deal with the unresolved trauma in any particular scenario that we've created, then once we've resuppressed it, the next attempt becomes a louder expression. So we make it more dramatic. We make it more people involved. We make it longer. One example, I'll give you a quick example. So one gentleman that I worked with had repeat car accidents, like 10 car accidents in the span of 3 years. And the first one was a fender bender, and the next one he got whiplash, and the next one he broke a bone, and the next one he passed out, and the next one he almost died. So every experience becomes louder. And as we worked that scenario back, and as we worked through the elements of each of those experiences, we got to a fundamental theme, which was, I'm impatient with life. I always want to get to the next step. I am not willing to be present in the current moment. I'm always reaching for the next step. And we identified impatience with life because he was always overriding clarities to get into the car, and he ended up in these scenarios prematurely, basically, by moving too quickly and not listening to clarities. He was overriding what may have caused him to stop, and had he stopped even for 2 minutes ahead of these events, then they would have dissolved or dissipated, and he would have created a different outcome for himself. So that's like a synopsis of how we bring all of those compounded traumas, bring them together, and work to identify the underliers in order to start making changes in our choices and behaviors. And so to work it back, we'll talk about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system for a moment. Are you guys familiar with sympathetic and parasympathetic? Yes, generally, quite, sort of. Okay. Yeah, so essentially the autonomic nervous system is designed for involuntary responses of the physiology. So parasympathetic is rest and digest and reproduce. Parasympathetic is fight, flight, or freeze. So the sympathetic dominant nervous system is designed for surviving imminent threat of death. That is the sole purpose of sympathetic dominance. So lions, tigers, bears, more recently guns and knives. If these things present themselves in your reality, you activate, your body perceives threat of life, and you activate the sympathetic dominance, which causes increased heart rate, increased respiration rate. It pumps blood flow out to the periphery, to your arms and legs, so that you can either fight or run. And it is designed to help you survive an imminent threat of death. The issue is that we have created a paradigm in which we now interpret much of our daily life is interpreted as threat of death, which causes the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So taxes, traffic, rush hour traffic, deadlines, even emotional experiences will create a stress response in a lot of people. A lot of people can't experience excitement without mounting a stress response. They're unable to allow the feelings of anger without mounting a stress response. So it's creating a scenario where the emotion starts to come up, but then the stress response ignites almost instantly, which prevents us from feeling the depth of the emotion, and it causes that emotion to then be suppressed or overridden first and then suppressed back into the body, which then causes this recurring pattern to develop where the being is trying to mount it again to experience it fully, because my understanding is that we've come into this life, onto this plane, into this realm to experience the experience of experiencing life. We're here to experience, period. And if we don't allow ourselves to experience to the depth that we're able, then we're just going to keep creating louder scenarios to try to get ourselves to have the opportunity to experience the depth of our emotional capacity. And so to elaborate a little more on the sympathetic dominance, it's also it'll suppress the immune system because the priority is an external threat. So the immune system gets suppressed, and we're no longer scavenging for viruses, pathogens in the body, which allows for disease to propagate and develop and progress in the body while we're maintaining a prolonged stress state and a prolonged perception of threat of death externally. It also cuts off cognition to a great degree. So our higher cognitive processes get cut off because we're activating our reptilian brain, or our lower, more instinctive brain responses to simply focus on the survival of the organism, which prevents us from accessing memories. It prevents us from accessing the language that we want, which is why people often find themselves in a scenario where they're in a confrontation and they want to say something, but it doesn't come out in that moment. And then after the main blow up or the main event, 5 minutes later, an hour later, they're on their own again, and now they're reflecting on that scenario, and they realize, oh, I should have said this. Oh, I wanted to say that. Why didn't I say this? Well, that's because now you've finally calmed your system down. You've reactivated parasympathetics to a degree, which is allowing you to access higher cognitive processes, which is allowing you to now conceptualize the things that you wanted to say in that moment. But because you didn't take the opportunity, because you were unable to proceed in that manner in the moment, now you create this ruminating scenario and or recurring pattern in order to give yourself the opportunity to say these things, to conduct yourself in an authentic way in a next experience moving forward. So comparatively, the parasympathetic nervous system is basically the opposite. Your heart rate slows down, your respiration rate slows down, your blood flow returns to your core, so to your central area, and it reactivates your digestive organs. It allows for assimilation, absorption and assimilation of nutrients, which allows for restoration of your physical organism, which is not otherwise happening in a stress state. So when people are living constantly in stress, or 80 to 90% of their day is in stress, they're actually in a deterioration state. Their body is actually deteriorating because they're not reconstructing or rehabilitating. So not because we're inherently debilitating, which, slight segue, but it breaks my heart to recognize that in society at large, the idea is propagated that we are degenerative organisms. We're not inherently degenerative. We're actually inherently we have inherent restructuring capability, but because we live, and many people live so much in a stress state, they're allowing the deconstruction or deterioration of their organism, instead of facilitating the reconstruction or the inherent ability to reassimilate and repair and restore themselves. So bringing it back to, ideally, we live in parasympathetic dominant state 97% of every day. We encounter threat, we activate sympathetic dominance, we either get away from that threat or we die. And ideally, we get away from it. And then within 5 to 10 minutes, we have calmed our system and we have reinstated parasympathetic dominance. And so my work involves helping individuals to identify the moment that they find themselves in a triggering event or a triggering scenario, in order to one, identify what that trigger is connected to retroactively, what the original source trauma moment is, so that they can start navigating it and working with it. And then also I support them in the physiological retraining of helping their body to de-escalate from the stress state and reactivate parasympathetics in the moment of a real-time trigger, so that they can then proceed through this trigger in an authentic way, saying the things they need to say, behaving the way that they want to behave, and feeling the depth and intensity of the emotions involved in that particular trigger. And so that's going to include the emotions related to the current event, the individual. Maybe there's other individuals existing in this current event. So it involves feeling in the current event, but it also involves accessing the intensity of the emotions that needed to be felt in the original trauma. So umpteen examples, but I'll share. So one would be, so miscarriage. A woman experiences loss of a child, and she, the stress response may be mounted because she's in shock. She can't process the intensity of this loss, the grief, the agony, the heart-wrenching sensation of losing this baby. And then to be able to connect that back with an original loss or an original detachment or an original abandonment. The theme that I often see in grief associated with loss is an original abandonment scenario, where as a child, someone leaves their life and doesn't come back, completely left alone, and interpreting that they are not deserving of love because this person left. And in the child brain, they can't conceptualize why someone would leave them. And so then, in addition to processing the grief of the lost child in the current moment, we're then going into processing the grief and the confusion associated with being left as a child, or being abandoned as a child. So that, I guess, that's a bit of a synopsis of how I address the current and the past, and support the identification of a common underlying theme in reoccurring events. And I'm going to take it, I wonder if I should, let's do questions for a couple minutes. Generally speaking, people who express emotion to any degree are either labeled as crazy or unstable or psychotic. Get them to Ward 9 and get them medicated, period. And it's heart-wrenching. It is heart-wrenching because it is a socially constructed suppression of our capacity to experience life. And it is I mean, it's the end of our, if we allow it to continue as we allow it to continue, it's the end of our species as a human species, because we have the capacity for emotion and we deserve to feel and experience emotion. And the process of getting an individual back into being able to trust themselves to feel the emotion without regard for how anyone else is going to judge them or talk about them or interpret them, is it's a bit of a challenge. And so I work in a space that is basically set away from a lot of populations, so that I have the capacity to give people space to scream, to shout, to bawl, wail, um, and what comes out of people initially in the process. It's really dramatic initially, and not indefinitely, but initially it's so dramatic because it's been so suppressed and so bottled up for so long. But what comes out initially would definitely be qualified. If I had persisted in the psychology paradigm, I would be stamping and labeling these people with all kinds of conditions and medicating them like day one. It appears psychotic, but that is the nature of our emotions. And when we neglect to allow ourselves to feel how we need to feel, it will distort us. It will create psychosis in us. And yeah, and in my experience, it's fundamentally a social construct, the inappropriateness, the reason why it has been suppressed to the level that it's been suppressed. But at this point, I don't know that people necessarily recognize what, like, the intensity of what needs to happen first, because they say, like, the problem is that people are not feeling their emotions. Yeah, but like, it's intense. The intensity of what needs to happen first for people in order to get to a place where they can really engage with their emotions in a healthy way, and in a quote appropriate way. So the way, and again, I put it in quotations because I don't really define appropriateness, but I talk about energy chucking as well. And and so then once you give yourself that time to do that work, I encourage people to do what I call the inner child integration. Various work being done with the inner child. A lot of it is in the psychology realm. It's talked about parenting the inner child. So it's the older person who is taking care of the inner child, when in my experience, that's not what needs to happen. No child actually needs to be parented. They just want to share space. They're coming in to teach you more than you can ever potentially teach them. Yeah, so after going through the inner child integration process, then it becomes a little swifter for you to be able to spend the time right after a triggering event to say, oh, okay, this trigger is connected to that event. I'm going to go sit with my inner child and collect that fractured piece via that process. And that process takes time at first, and then it becomes faster and faster and faster, because every fractured piece is generally more ready to trust you quicker. And it's so exciting. It becomes a game, like it becomes the cosmic giggle, really. And it's really exciting when we discover our potential for ultimate resolution, wherein we can actually get ourselves to a state of enlightenment and joyful, magical play and celebration in this life. It's ecstasy. It's truly ecstasy. So yeah, so I'll share, I know we're heading over time at this point, so I'll share a little bit about the dolphins, but essentially, I've had connection with animals throughout my life, and several epic encounters with bear and cougar and mama bear with cubs, and we had a baby fawn deer before he reintegrated with his herd, and just lots of really cool connections. And the next level connection in my experience was with the dolphins. So I went to a retreat in Hawaii in 2016, which is when I connected with them first, and then I connected with them again in 2019. But essentially, I swam out into the ocean and I started singing, and within 5 minutes, this pod of dolphins shows up, and 4 or 5 of them broke from the pod, and they came and swam a tight circle around me with their eyes above water. And it truly felt like they were welcoming me home and inviting me into their pod. And for the next couple of hours, we treaded water, and I sang with different rhythms. And I sang faster, and they started jumping and spinning and playing. And then I slowed it way down, and they all stopped jumping and spinning, but a couple of them like twirled onto their back, and they were gliding through the water with their flippers in the air. So they were responding directly to the rhythms of the songs that I was singing. And so we played and danced. We played with they'd dive down, and they got leaves from the bottom, and they were like bringing stuff up for me to play with. Like it was, and I was diving with them and swimming with them, and it was just epic. And to the point where I decided to swim out every day and start singing, and every day consistently, within 5-10 minutes of me singing. And I sang, but I kept my vocal cords underwater, so it transmitted much more effectively. So 5-10 minutes and the pod would show up again, and they'd stay and they'd play for a good couple hours. And towards the end of the week, in 2019, there was a local there that he gifted me the name Meleokanaya, which means spirit of the dolphins. And he said, yeah, I mean, these guys are around, they show up once in a while, they eat, and then they leave. Like they're never in here this often for this long. So you're obviously having influence. And it was, yeah, it was humbling, to put it mildly. There's not really an appropriate word in the English language to describe it. But I certainly carry dolphin energy, and I since then have done a lot of meditative work with the dolphins, and I feel that they are now willing. They've always been willing, but they're willing to work with me in allowing me to bring in other people who they're willing to interact with, play with. And so I've developed a retreat, which is essentially a gateway into doing some of the deeper, intense and extended trauma work in the one-on-one capacity. But the retreat is a 5-day retreat where we initially start to identify some of the underlying trauma and identify current triggers, current undesired behaviors, and then using that to start accessing some of the fundamental traumas, and then start the process of working through clearing that noise to the point where we're going into the water and we're singing to the dolphins and encouraging them to come and interact and play with the whole group of people. So it's a really exciting process, and the energy of this species is something I don't actually know how to describe in the English language, but it's magic beyond magic, and all they ever want to do is play. Like that's all they know how to do is play. And so if you're there trying to do anything else, they're just gonna be like, what? And so that's why the focus of the retreat is getting people to a point where they've cleared out enough of their junk that they're not going to actually repel the dolphins, but where they're ready to receive the opportunity to play and to invite magic into their experience. And then the dolphins will help to reinforce that. And one thing, Michelle, you and I were commenting on, we had both seen too, the capacity for the dolphins to respond and support other beings is phenomenal. Thanks for the opportunity and the platform. I love sharing this reality with people, and the possibilities are really exciting. Exactly.
So,
And I
empowering,
play with,
think.
like, I try to fuck the mind a little bit in that, in saying we're here to experience the experience of experiencing life. Because when you compound it like that, then the brain tries to like figure it out and it can't. And it's like, so you just have to feel it.